Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Riley, cruise ship speaker, and as you can see from this first slide, I'm a scientist by training. You may also have guessed from the image on the left that I have an interest in astronomy. So a little about myself. I've travelled extensively around the world, for holidays of course, but also for work. Work gave me the opportunity to travel quite extensively to remote parts of Southeast Asia and also to South America. Work also gave me the opportunity to enhance my presentation skills, which I've used extensively, talking to both school children in classrooms, local community groups, and also at universities. I've also travelled quite a lot on cruise ships. This gave me the opportunity to enhance my PowerPoint skills. I'm now quite an advanced PowerPoint user. So a little bit about my cruise experience. I've spoken on cruise and maritime voyages, on Fred Olsen, on Princess Cruises, Saga Cruise Lines, Celebrity Cruises, and now with Viking Ocean Cruises I'm a resident astronomer. And my wife and I now have clocked up over 75 cruises to date, both as fare-paying passengers and as a speaker on the cruise ships. So let's take a look about some of my talks. As you've guessed, astronomy is quite interesting to me. So let's take a look at my astronomy and space-related talks. So we can take a look at the sun, our local star. It bathes us in heat and light, nurtures life. It also gives us the wonderful colours that we see around the world in plants and animals. But will our local star, the sun, live forever? We will talk about that in some detail. We can take a trip around the universe, our solar system. We'll go from planet to planet, talking about what the planets are made of and how they were formed. We'll use some wonderful video clips from NASA, showing here flying through the rings of Saturn, probably one of the most beautiful planets in the solar system. But of course, all the planets have their own stories to tell. What about how it all began? The birth of the universe, aka the Big Bang. How did the universe spring into existence? How did the solar system form? And again, will this last forever or will it come to an end one day? And what about what it's all made of? The tiny world of atoms. We and everything in the world are made up of tiny particles called atoms. If you're a scientist like me, and mainly as a chemist, you'll understand that these are made up of the 92 elements of the periodic table. Then we can take a look at the wonderful light displays in the northern and southern hemispheres, the aurora borealis in the north, driven by our turbulent sun. It was the first space scientist, Christian Birkeland from Norway, who first proposed that it was the sun that gave us the wonderful northern lights. I'm often asked what's the best way to see the northern lights, and unfortunately it means taking a trip on the International Space Station, where you'll see the northern lights several times a day as it passes around the Earth. So what about the space race? Cosmonauts and astronauts. Here we have Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, followed by Alan Shepard, the American, who didn't quite make it into space. The first true spaceman in orbit was John Glenn.
Good Lord, ride all the ways. You've got speed, John Glenn. 10, 9.
And he and the other astronauts were part of what was called the Mercury 7, all pilots in the American Air Force. So how about the mysteries of time? Why is there 24 hours in a day? Why 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour? The mystery of time and the importance of the Greenwich Mean Time at Greenwich. Why was that so important for setting the time zones around the world? And finally, we'll take a look at why it was very important to develop accurate clocks to help us navigate safely at sea. So let's take a look at our moon, the closest celestial object to us. We'll take a look at the myths and stories about the moon, but of course we'll end up taking an in-depth look at the first moon landings, which gave America a great lead in the space race. Maybe at this point in time, astronomy is not relevant for a cruise, so let's take a look at eating, drinking and looking good. Let's take a look at the history of tea, how tea evolved from its first use in China and how it spread to the world And we'll take a look at some of the rises of the major tea brands we see around the world today. And how did afternoon tea, often served on cruise ships, how did that begin and who was responsible for it? Perhaps coffee is more to your taste. Invented or discovered in Ethiopia by a goat herder, rose to fame in the Yemen, but got to its pinnacle in the Middle East with various coffee houses around the Middle East. It came into England and we had coffee houses were formed. These coffee houses were intellectual places where the intellectuals met to discuss the stories of the day. They were called penny universities. Many of them involved into some of the institutions we see today, like Lloyd's of London and like the Stock Exchange. Or how about chocolate? Its origin in South America with the Incas, and again through to the major brands that we see today. What about sugar? Important today with diabetes and obesity, but where did sugar evolve from? Who invented the sugar cube? And of course we need to touch on the dark side of sugar, how it was involved in the slave trade. But what about makeup to die for? And believe me, some people did. We'll look at its origins in Egypt, the famous Cleopatra look. With this look, they used quite dangerous materials that we think of today, lead, arsenic, mercury to get the colours on their faces, and people died from it. In Victorian times, the rage was green dresses, unfortunately dyed with an arsenic dye, which was absorbed through the skin, hence the stories of the waltz of death. And we'll end on makeup with the rise of the modern makeup brands and how they got their names. Perhaps it's time for a gin and tonic. We need to go to South America, where we have the fever tree that was used by the locals. They used the bark to control shakes and shivers, but it had a peculiar bitter taste that went well with gin. But we need the fizzy water for the tonic water, invented in a brewery in Leeds. And we shouldn't forget the characteristic taste of gin from juniper berries. And finally, did the British in India really use gin and tonic to control malaria? On a different tack, we'll take a look at Norway, the sounds, the sights, the myths of Norway. We'll look at the fjords. We'll look at the waterfalls. Here we have the Seven Sisters in Geiranger Fjord. We'll take a look at some peculiar mountains, peculiar shapes, all linked to stories of Norway and often linked to the trolls. And finally, we shouldn't forget the local people, the Sami, the famous reindeer herders of the region. Let's take a trip down memory lane. A man called William Hesketh Lever built an empire based on soap. His first one was called Sunlight Soap, not far from Liverpool. His business grew. He developed more brands, Lifebuoy soap. He was a fantastic fan of art, and he often used art in advertising. Do you remember this man? Captain Birdseye, famous for advertising frozen fish fingers? Well, Lever got involved with those. And of course, Captain Birdseye was a real man. It was actually Clarence Birdseye, an American who actually invented the frozen foods business. And who remembers the day when peas went from grey to green? The first advert on UK TV, Birdseye peas. And who remembers the little girl who said, "Sweet is the moment when the pod went pop"? And finally, we'll take a look at Christmas traditions. We'll take a look at Christmas crackers, Christmas trees, their decorations. We'll take a look at the history of Christmas cards. And finally, we'll take a look at Christmas dinners. I hope you enjoyed that preview of some of my talks, and I'm looking forward to cruising with you in the near future.